Imagine yourself looking out at the vast sea before you. You reach down and you put a hand into the water and you scoop it up towards you. Immediately the water starts leaking through your fingers until the hand is empty. That water is a man's life. From birth to death, it is always slipping through our hands until it is gone, along with all that you hold dear in this world.
Hey guys, I'm Luke. The world is a really weird place. So many people are lost, but fortunately, a lot of people are at least working that out. And I'm here to take the gloves off and explore the question, what's the point anyway? I went through my own deep exploration on this question over the past 5 years, and after 30 years of atheism, I became a Christian. I'm not really a typical Christian or churchgoer. In fact, I really struggle with much of what modern Christianity projects itself to the wider world. And I'd actually disagree with more Christians than I agree on with what the point is anyway. So what I want to do with this podcast is bring on guests with all different worldviews and put their perspectives in the furnace of ideas and really challenge them to find out which ones make the most sense. I believe that the truth is knowable, and through vigorous debate and questioning, we can uncover it. Join me as I stress test all these ideas and try to answer the question of what the point is anyway. Welcome back to What's the Point Anyway? My guest tonight is an old friend who I knew I wanted to get on as a guest the moment I decided to create this show. Erika Geraerts is an entrepreneur, a writer, a creative, a voracious reader, and a general ponderer of all things life. In her early 20s, in the very infancy of social media, she was a co-founder of one of the first influencer-led brands, Frank Body. She almost had a big exit on that, but life took a different turn, and far from retiring at 21, she spent the next decade or so defining herself and is currently the founder of a beauty brand called Fluff. As with all guests, I'm far more interested in how life stories have shaped worldviews, more so than the life stories themselves. So, Eri, here you are in your mid-30s as someone with plenty of life experience. Have you worked out what the point of life is anyway?
I'm genuinely more excited about this podcast than any beauty podcast I've been on, and the discussion that that's going to be ahead of us. But what's the point? Look, I am still pondering, and I think that potentially is the point, to surrender control and to just think that for me, life is long, and so long as I keep questioning and being open and curious, at the end, hopefully I'll have some better reflections.
Perfect. It's funny you said you're sort of listening to your thoughts, and that's a point. I was reading an article or an interview you did a few years ago, and you said your biggest challenge in life is understanding your own thoughts.
Definitely.
Have you got better at that?
At times, definitely. But again, I think it's around this sort of surrender that they are going to do their own thing. And for me, it's about not reacting as I have in the past to those thoughts and just trying to remain equanimous, or whether you're maybe like familiar with. And that's been a big thing in my life in the last sort of 10 years, is trying to understand when events happen, and the next thing is my response to those events.
Yeah. I mentioned in the intro your time sort of in your early 20s with Frank Body, and I would say, looking at, having known you for so long and looking at you through that experience, it definitely hasn't defined you. I think if I look at who you are now, it's so completely different to a co-founder of a heavily sort of influencer-led beauty brand. And yet I think the lessons through that experience seem to have really shaped who you've ended up becoming. What was it like sort of being in your early 20s, dealing with sort of the fame, potential money that came with that, and then dealing with the aftermath of it?
Yeah. Look, I've honestly been unpacking it for the last 7 years with therapy, with a lot of self-reflection with books, with meditation, with like experimenting with certain other modalities, just to be like, what happened? Because often when you're in it and when you're in 20s, it's just like you're just being taken on this ride. And I
Yeah.
don't think any 20-something-year-old should be expected to have the awareness of what they're going through. And sometimes still I think, oh, it's just my experience. It just was what happened. And it's only when I stop to be like, that was quite an abnormal experience for a 20-year-old.
Mm.
And, would I give advice to my younger self? What kind of advice am I giving to young people now? Or do you just say you've got to learn it the hard way? I think looking back, what I was exposed to in my 20s, is something that some people don't experience at all in their life, or definitely not until later. And I'm actually quite grateful for having that lesson quite young, because I feel like I dipped my toes in this big ego battlefield. And I mean, we're all constantly dealing with our ego, but it was sort of like it was magnified for me at that time. And I feel lucky that I sort of got pulled out of it and had this chance to stop and pause and reflect and decide, like, where am I now? Where do I want to go? And it was sort of a very distinct, like, fork in the road of the person I would have been had I stayed in that business or gone down the trajectory of having this big exit. And then the last 7 years that I've had.
Yeah. So how old were you when you started it?
So the first two businesses I had, I started when I was 21 years old, and Frank Body was 23 to 26.
Yeah.
And we experienced this sort of crazy growth within 3 years that most businesses might either never experience or might experience over 10 plus years.
Mm.
And it was so exciting, not just from a financial perspective, but from this sort of like ambition perspective, from this social status perspective. There was so much happening around me and to me, and I was just very much consumed by it and just intoxicated by it in a way. I
Yeah.
loved it, and it was what I thought I wanted, or what anyone would want. And again, it wasn't until that path didn't eventuate, and then I had to deal with the aftermath, that I then had to reflect on it. And I'm genuinely still reflecting on it. It comes back and forth in waves about what I experienced, like the breakdown of my business partnership when I decided to leave, the sort of reflections about who I was and how I was perceived versus who I was afterwards and how I was perceived.
Mm. And because, like, it was sort of the mid 2010s, so it was a time where, like, there's heaps of venture capital rolling around, valuations were super high, and your shareholding and what your value was on paper may have been huge, but obviously the difference between paper and actually having sort of funds cleared in your bank account are two different stories. But what was it like then? Because, you would have been 25 and sort of thinking you might be retired by the age of 30. Everything's going fantastic. Here's what this might mean for life for the next 30 years afterwards. What was it like the moment after? And obviously the leaving was pretty tumultuous. Was there a period in time when you realized, like, that dream was over and the reality of what you had out of it was right there in front of it? You could see it. There was no more upside because it was finished. Did that really hit you at a specific moment?
It hit pretty quickly. And for context, it's that we were sort of looking at investment from a big heritage brand that would have set us all up, probably. But I had chosen to leave the business as part of that investment. There were 5 of us as co-founders, and I realized that it wasn't my path forward and that there would be an opportunity for me to leave, obviously trading off the potential future success or future increased buyout or payout that I could get. But I knew it was right, and I was happy to leave earlier. Anyway, that investment fell through, but I had already started these discussions about leaving the business, which had caused a lot of upset and tension within the group. So I had to follow through with that. But because that investment didn't go through, one, I was left with a huge legal bill for my individual representation, and two, I had just foregone or chosen to leave my two jobs in very, I guess, comfortable salaries. So it hit me very quickly that one, I had a huge legal bill or debt to pay and no salary to accommodate that. And because I was in my 20s, I had just been living a very frivolous life, spending the money that I was earning and having a great time. Almost thought that it wasn't going to end. And some people could look back at that and be like, that was sort of silly. I look back on it and be like, I was in my early 20s. I was having fun.
And you're in
you
that
know.
very moment there and then.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
extremely present in that. And I look at my relationship to money, which has been a big thing I've reflected on the last 7 years, and to probably why I did act that way. And it's very much a part of who I am and what I'd been taught about money. And I probably wouldn't change it. But it was a big shock to be like, cool, I had this idea of who I was and who I was going to be, and that's just been shattered. But it really proves this point, and something that I still say to people now is that money is never yours until it hits your bank account. So there's no point really having or thinking about ownership of it. It's not yours, and it so easily can be taken away from you. But it doesn't define who you were, because, the day before I didn't have that money either. But we build up in our heads this idea of who we are with it. And it was a very big ego trip because we were having conversations with people around us, people knew, the people closest to me, and then I had to communicate to them that wasn't what I was going to be doing. That life that I was beginning to dream about was not actually a reality. And I had to start thinking about what would be next.
And what's so I guess in the 7 years since that period of time, what do you think's been the biggest changes in you as a person?
I think my relationship to money, while in some ways is still the same, I feel less attached to the idea of it. So while I think I'm still quite ambitious and like the idea of wealth generation, I also feel very happy with what I have and realize that isn't what makes me happy at the end of the day. When I was earning sort of more and it was this untapped resource, it was actually probably the most unhappy I had been. And everyone kind of says that, but I had that experience myself. So for me, it's been about what I'm motivated by, or why I'm then still choosing to try and build something. If it's not purely for wealth generation, what is it for? What's the driver for me? I think that's one of maybe the biggest changes. And then just about, because I love work and I will always want to work and be creating something. It's about who I create with and not relying on an outcome, really knowing that anything can change, that there's so much is outside of my control. And the only thing I can control is really how I respond to it.
Yeah. And so what do you think, what are the biggest motivators now?
I am constantly motivated just by this desire to create. It's quite simple, but to put something out there that wasn't there before and to connect with people via a medium, whether that's like a product or a service. So I just love the act of creation and seeing it impact people or how they behave and how they think. And if I can impact how they behave or think in some sort of positive way, that's a good thing for me.
Yeah. And do you want to talk a little bit about what you're actually doing now?
Yeah. So, it's interesting because after I left Frank Body, I was like, I've still got a brand in me. And my ego wanted to prove that not just to myself, but to my previous business partners and to the industry. And I also knew that there was some momentum from our success, that if I was going to get investment, which I wanted at the time, that I would need to do it quickly off the back of the success of Frank Body. So I had also spent a lot of time in America looking at other brands that are obviously just operating at another level compared to Australian brands. I was looking in the makeup space as compared to skincare, which Frank Body was in, and saw a big gap in the Australian market for a makeup brand, and particularly for a younger generation, so Gen Z, as opposed to the millennial customer that Frank Body was targeting. And there was no really Australian brands focusing on Gen Z. So this was anyone at the time between, say, like 13 and 17. So I became obsessed with them and really feel still that they kind of are the undercurrent of culture and that they are influencing all the other generations. And we raised just under $1 million. And again, that was sort of another ego boost for me to be like, I can still do this. I can keep doing this. And I wanted to operate at the same level as Frank. So I then say that the last 7 years has been me just eating a lot of humble pie and realizing that just because you've done something once before doesn't mean that you can do it again just as easily. And that Frank Body was really the exception to the rule. And the rule in business is typically flogging it out for 10 plus years or businesses failing. And it's been great because if Fluff had experienced the success that Frank Body had, I can't imagine what that would have done to my ego.
Yeah.
So I'm really, like, it's been hard, but I'm grateful for the lessons. And 7 years in, we're starting to see the growth that I always imagined for the brand and the business. And there's so much more gratitude for it. And I know that it's the gratitude for it or the acceptance of it. It's actually got nothing to do with me really anymore. Like, I don't think that's my work. I think it's like this cumulative effort over these years and of so many people and of the industry moving. Like, I've kind of removed myself from it.
Do you remember, I think, I'm not sure whether we've spoken about this, but I think it was must have been just before you started Fluff, or maybe it was early. It might have actually been very early days. A mutual friend of ours, Jeff, when we caught up for dinner, he said to you, I mean, it's such a poignant comment now looking back on it. But he's like, Erika, I don't know whether I want you to go off and create this and for it to be a raging success, or whether I want you to go off and create this and for it to be a massive failure.
Yeah, Jeff has been in a lot of ways one of my greatest supporters, but he just gives me a reality check every time I see him. And I'm grateful for it because in the investment space, you have a lot of people blowing smoke up your ass and telling you that you are amazing, or you have a lot of people not giving you the time of day and really deflating you. So I think Jeff has a very firm but fair way of talking about the realities of having a business. And I agree with him. Like, I am glad that I've gotten served a humble pie and that it has been a hard slog with Fluff. It's made me appreciate it. It's made me stop and learn more. It's made me reflect on what it takes to be a founder and to run a business and to create change in an industry.
How, I mean, you're an interesting character in so many ways, right? Like,
You can say that too, because you've known me now for, 15 plus years?
No, I think we're older than that. 15
Oh,
doesn't.
God.
15 doesn't even take us back to when we're at
Maybe
school.
20.
So it's
Yeah,
more like
wow.
20 and maybe 25 even, which is scary. But it's I was going to say, like, you're a contradiction in many ways, but I don't say that in like a negative way. But, you know, you're outgoing in your personal, but you're very much like your alone time. And then, you know, you're founder of two beauty brands and spend all your days on social media and dealing with influencers, but you're not really into social media and and influencers. How have you sort of thought about yourself as a person, particularly over the last decade, when your whole life has been consumed by, like, how have you balanced that work and how that flows into who you are as a person and the fact that has become so linked with Erika Geraerts?
Yeah, it's been hard at times because Frank Body was such a big part of my identity, and that world can become very all-consuming, whether it's social media, whether it's the influencer space, whether it's the beauty space, and the expectations of a founder, or a female founder. There's a lot involved. And like I always say, I'm not obsessed with beauty. Like, there's so many contradicting things about what I do and why I've chosen to be in this industry. And some days I ask myself, why am I doing this? Like, why am I still here? And for me, it's not about beauty at all. I've always been a curious person, and I'm obsessed with the way that people think and how they interact with other people and how they perceive themselves and then how they present themselves to the world. And because we live in this capitalist consumerist world, it's like we interact via products and we interact via brands. And that's what I'm interested in. And I think that things and stuff and consumption is okay. Like, we are human beings who desire things and want things. And they are all, in a way, an expression of ourselves and our deep wants and desires and our needs. But it's about how can we be conscious of that consumption? What is okay? What is not okay? When is it a sort of active choice versus a choice that's influenced by something that we're not really thinking about? So that's sort of how I think I've stayed in this industry, or those points I often have to keep reminding myself, because I'm not immune to the tactics of brands or marketing or advertising. Perhaps because of my background in journalism and then working in a marketing agency, you lift the hood of the car, or you get to see behind the curtain. So you see more of the inner workings, so you're less influenced by it. And then you have some sort of calling to make a change. And that was the thing for me. Like, there's been lots of times where I've wanted to back down, but I have just thought there needs to exist an alternative narrative. And it doesn't have to be a polarizing one or the other end of the spectrum. It can just be somewhere in the middle.
Mm.
And that emotional driver for me, particularly in the beauty industry, was creating a better brand with more responsible messaging for my younger cousins at the time. And perhaps I was always also creating that for a younger version of me that I didn't feel like existed.
Mm. So, like, where do you, being in this space that is all consuming, and sort of giving that answer that you just gave then, like, where has it left you as the person that's Erika, that's separate from what you do in business and what you think about the beauty industry and everything else? And I know you mentioned before, like, there's been therapy sessions about sort of the fallout from Frank, like, when you strip it all back. And I think this is a challenge, because I think you're naturally a creator, you're naturally a entrepreneur, and you're naturally all in. A lot of people that have those traits end up like burning themselves down to the bone and being all in and not being able to separate themselves from it.
So, look, I've always, for whatever reason, had some inclination to either second guess or be curious or wonder about my motivations behind something. I think that's probably something that my dad influenced. Like, he was sort of always also questioning and very curious, and always spoke to us about our attitude determining our actions or our lives. My dad was a tennis player, and I think that was his own learnings and teaching. It was such a mental game.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always been aware of the mental aspects of any activity, really. And I think I applied that to business, to be like, what is happening in front of me versus like, how am I viewing it?
Mm-hmm.
And therapy, I think, was really helpful after I left Frank Body, not just for like to discuss or understand that business breakdown, but then for my own personal reasons and some of my like family reasons that I hadn't really looked into. Then I've always done yoga, which I think is a really interesting practice for understanding like what's kept in your body, or your body manifesting your like internal dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've spoken about like meditation's been a big practice for me, and my form is vipassana, which is very much like a deep discipline practice as opposed to the sort of Western surface level practices of meditation. So it's like I've just always been curious and questioning, like, why do I think this way? Why am I feeling sad? Why am I feeling happy? And then why are other people feeling sad or happy? So it's just like this second guessing of my actions or my thoughts that have, I think, motivated me.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about Vipassana?
Yes, I'd love to. If that's my sort of dana, my donation, that someone else ends up doing a Vipassana course after hearing this, I'd be stoked. Was it you who actually maybe got me originally on it? I feel like you spoke about a friend who had done it, or it was someone else told me about it. and was like, I had a friend who did this course, but they left because they couldn't handle it.
So when did I do? I did it in.
You did it after me.
I did it in 2011. Yeah.
Oh, okay, because I think I was 2010 that I did my first one.
Yeah.
So someone had told me about it. And look, Vipassana is a very disciplined, peculiar practice, and it's not for everyone. I think when people hear about it, they either say, that sounds absolutely batshit crazy, why would anyone do that? Or they say, that sounds amazing, sign me up. The batshit crazy element of it is totally understandable. It is a 10-day course in which you are meditating for 14 or so hours every day, waking up at 4 a.m., meditating till 9 p.m., only eating 2 meals a day. It's like deep therapy or plant medicine combined with horrible back pain. Not literally, but in terms of like the pain is literal, but the outcome of like the therapy or the trips that you go on is almost the equivalent. But for me, it was just a sort of a theory that really resonated in terms of, they say it's about seeing things as they really are, and this universal law of nature, and that everything is changing. And once we accept sort of the impermanence of nature or of life and don't respond or react to it, that our whole life or our whole outlook will change. And I was very curious about that. So I did my first course when I was 21, absolutely went into it naively, not knowing what I was getting myself into.
And you just did that in locally?
Yeah, in Victoria. And it changed my life. And I think I was reflecting on it all the time. Like it's something that it makes a huge impact at the time. And then throughout your life, you just remember what it has sort of taught you and what you have experienced. And I would keep going in the last, 14 years since, to 3-day courses. But I did my second 10-day course just recently. And
so that's the first time, that was the first time you've done the 10 days again?
Yeah.
Right.
So I've just done the 3-day ones in between that, because it was funny. I built this huge resistance to taking 10 days again to do it, because it is a lot. And when you know what you're going to go through, that you're basically going to turn your brain inside out and go insane and then come back to sanity, it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's an undertaking, but very much worthwhile from so many perspectives, from a professional perspective, from an interpersonal relationship perspective, from a creative perspective. It just gives so much to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, they talk about it being not to do with any sects or like religions, like anyone can practice it. But I would say it is the closest thing I have to a belief or a sort of religious practice in a way. And I see it benefiting so much of my life, from my work to my personal relationships to just how I see myself and navigate all of these things.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, on this last course, what it really shows is like things that you are holding on to that are sort of stored within your unconscious. And this time I had a lot of thoughts and visuals about leaving the Frank body and about my two friendships and my business partners, which was wild. I was expecting a lot of other stuff to come up, and I genuinely laughed. I was like, really? The business still? But wild, and to think that I was so young at the time when I left that business, and that it can stay with you for 15 or so years, so you can hold on to these experiences.
I might get you to talk a little bit about the teachings of it and the philosophies and so forth, because as you know, I did it in 2011, so I was early 20s, but I didn't just do it locally. I went over to I was in Calcutta in India and did it in their 45-degree humidity with only Indian people in there, and they didn't speak. There was no, so it was silent, but any speaking was in Indian. So mine was I didn't really understand or follow any of the philosophy side of it. For me, it was more just a mental challenge to sit in this heat for 10 days straight and not speak and get through it. What's the
That would have been hard.
It was hard work, but it was it was rewarding to complete it. But I did it really differently. I mean, we've spoken about the the term anicca, which is like their idea of sort of impermanence, and I think there's some really good takeaways from it. But for me, it was probably more of just a mental battle and something that I could do and complete that I got so much out. I actually got so much out of. But in terms of the philosophies and the views and what is taught and what it looks like, can you talk about that? Because I think you're a much better place than I am.
Yeah, sure. And it was the reason why I also wanted to go back again, because each night there is a discourse in which the S.N. Goenka, who is sort of the founder of Vipassana, or who brought it to the Western world, explains to you the philosophies or the teachings and what you will have experienced in that day and what you probably will have gone through and what questions might be coming up. So, yes, essentially Dharma is this universal law attached to the practice of Vipassana, and that's the actual meditation technique. It has to be taught over 10 days because it is such a deep practice, and it's sort of, they call it like an operation in which you are really going to the depths of your unconscious state to uncover like the miseries in your body or in your unconscious that you are holding on to and that is holding you back in life. And, you know, miseries is such a loaded word and people, I think, feel quite uncomfortable talking about that. But as human beings, it's like we all have miseries, right? We are all carrying something we've all experienced. Pain in some way or another, or we are either craving or having aversions to things in our life. And Vipassana is really about, I guess, cracking open that vault and inquiring and looking into what those are and trying to detach from them in a way. So this universal law, this law of nature, and this practice came from Buddha, something like 2,500 years ago, and has been passed down, is essentially that everything changes, that nothing is permanent, specifically to our like thoughts and our feelings around events. So an event can happen. It can be sad, it can be painful, it can be happy, it can be amazing. But after that moment in time or that event, like it changes, it will pass. And then our mind essentially attaches to that event and tries to carry it into the future, or it attaches to the past. And it's really about, I guess, maintaining presence and maintaining equanimity, which is basically being undisturbed by these fluctuations in life and not seeing one as good or bad. So you experience pleasant things, you experience bad things, and can you remain unattached to each of those events and not crave the pleasant experiences and not have aversion to the bad experiences? And this all is experienced within the practice because you are sitting for so long every day. You're experiencing a lot of not just mind chatter going around, and it's like we crave the like beautiful meditation feeling that some people get to experience, and then we dislike or we have aversion to the busy mind or the distracted mind or the bad thoughts. Whereas the whole practice is about being aware that they are there, but that they will arise and that they will pass. And when you can maintain that equanimous state, this is where you sort of find freedom or liberation. Of course, it's very hard, and the whole thing is that it's not permanent, that it is constantly changing. And that's the hardest thing about meditation that I still think so many people don't understand, is that everyone's chasing that like, oh, I meditate, I'm blissful, I'm calm. It's like meditating it's experiencing it all. And it's the only thing I actually wanted to add when you were like, what's the point? And for me right now, it's about feeling it all, the good, the bad, and accepting it, not chasing one or the other or running away from one or the other. So yeah, it's a 10-day practice because you spend the first 3 days as literally listening to your breath and trying to sharpen your mind and focus your mind onto your breath. And then on the 4th day, you learn this Vipassana meditation technique in which you start tuning into the sensations on your body at the most like subtle level. So obviously, you know, we would all feel like an itch or some like painful thing in our shoulders because we're sitting there all day. But then there are also these like subtle vibrations or feelings going on at any point in the day throughout our whole body. And it's really about tuning into that. And again, not craving the like beautiful euphoric sensations And then when you have this searing pain in your back, not being like, I need to get out of this. I want to move. I want to change this. And it's amazing because you can be in this position or have this feeling that feels like the worst feeling you've ever experienced, that you'll never escape. But when you kind of can hold that space for it and stay with it, all of a sudden it just disappears. And you really feel, you have this felt experience of things arising and passing. I mean, this is me trying to explain, obviously, in a couple of minutes what it is. And I'm almost hesitant to do that because it's just something you have to experience yourself. And even if someone listens to this and goes, oh, yeah, okay, I'm listening, and that makes kind of logical sense, their whole thing within this course is that you have to experience it yourself, because unless you have that felt experience, like you can't fully understand it.
Mm-hmm. So how does I'd love to sort of segue that into what you spoke about in terms of where that has led your sort of spiritual worldviews. Because I mean, you and I are the same, I guess. We were raised, went to finished from, graduated at Catholic schools as sort of non-believing atheists that trusted in things that we could touch and feel, and thought most of the teachings at the school were, I don't know, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but I know I certainly thought it was more or less nonsense. And then, I mean, 3 years ago, you probably thought I'd gone mad when I told you that I'd become Christian. Where does this teaching and everything else that you've experienced lead you around thoughts around, is there a God? What is God? What is the nature of God? Why are we here? Where'd we come from?
Yeah, it's a great series of questions. I think, so Vipassana for me particularly feels like a very realistic, practical approach to how I view life and what happens in life. It is more closely linked, I believe, to like Buddhist theory, which I also resonate with. And the sort of, one of their like noble truths is that suffering is inevitable, or that, you know, we can't avoid it in life. And I think I see the most pain in life or in people around me when they try and avoid suffering, or they try and deny it. And so Vipassana is very much about accepting the reality of it, but knowing that it changes. And suffering obviously comes in all different forms. Suffering can be losing a friendship, losing a business partnership, having a breakup, death. Like there's so many ways in which we suffer in life, and that we make these situations bigger than they are. And my whole thing has been about not resisting it. I think I grew up in a family that avoided talking about suffering and was very much, you know, this, from my dad's side, from this sport attitude of just like, you just keep going and you get on with it. And from my mum's sort of very secret family side of just like, we don't talk about things. We just smile and we're very people pleasing and we get on with it. And for me, it's been around like breaking away from those models and defining my own truth or my own way of being, which is just like accepting suffering as a part of life, but then choosing how I want to respond to it. And it's helped in all these ways in sort of what I deal with on a day-to-day, because everyone that I interact with, I can't control their experience or what they're going to say or do to me. I can only control how I respond and react. So that's really like the biggest thing. How that relates to then like a God, or where did we come from, or where are we going after this, is an interesting one. I think that God for me is like a belief in something or someone. And I don't think it's bad to have a belief in something or someone, but I think it's bad to believe that your something or someone is right over someone else's. And I think that, it's like whether your God is a person or whether it's an object or whether it's a belief in yourself. I think belief is sort of important, or something that some people sometimes want to hold on to. When I think about, what happens when we die, I often remind myself, well, what happened before I was born? And I find a lot of comfort in thinking it's just the same thing, and that I don't stress about what happened before I was born. So why am I stressed about what's going to happen when I die? I feel like I'll just be the same good I was before I was born. If that makes sense. Or for me, it makes it like, that's what feels so ridiculous about asking the questions like, what happens when we die? I'm like, well, why isn't anyone stressing about what happened before we were born?
Yeah.
Or being like, what was the big black abyss or hole before I came into this world? And, with Vipassana in particular, they have a practice of how people should live their life too, which I think other religions do. And it's a very compassionate practice in terms of how they treat other people, what they do and don't do, these sort of noble precepts that they follow, which also make a lot of sense to me. And the fact that it's not saying that they have this God or person to believe in that is better than one other. Like, they want everyone to be able to practice this. It's more about like the mastery of your mind, the purification of your mind, and then like spreading goodwill, which I think no one can really argue with.
Yeah. Do you believe in all the teachings, and do all the teachings answer all the questions that you have, or is there gaps and is there yearning for more?
Yeah, that's a great question. I personally, it's been the most sound sort of teachings that I have come across. I mean, they don't discuss where we came from, or where we're going after this. It's really focused on the present, around like just dealing with while you were here, which I think is an interesting thing. I guess I could say that those are the gaps, but I also don't go there looking for those answers. I've really tried to, I guess, ground myself just in the present practice about dealing with the reality now. And in being, I guess, a good person, or in following this practice, there's some sort of security or feeling that whatever does happen when I die, I've lived well.
Yeah. It's funny because I mean, we spoke a little bit before we hit record about sort of who my audience is and who my guests have been. Most of my views on sort of Christian doctrine are pretty vastly opposed to what the mainstream views are. So most of them would call me like a heretic and any other words. But I think one of the biggest misnomers of Christianity, largely thanks to bad teaching from Christians themselves, is that the teachings of Jesus in the Bible are all about doing what we do so we go some great place when we die. I think, it even says verses about you're seated in the heavenly places now, that it's not sort of waiting it out on earth for the end of time to dwell in this eternal heavenly place. It's all about actually sort of bringing the heavenly onto earth and being sort of the salt and light in the world today. So,
yes. And they actually discuss this in one of the discourses, where a lot of religions, have this question about, but what happens when I die? Or I've been good, will I get through the gates of heaven? And S.N. Goenka, this leader, he's extremely charming and very funny in all of his discourses. And he sort of says, he's like, you really think that someone is up there with like a clipboard being like, oh, yep, you did good, okay, you can go through. It's just like, it's kind of preposterous in a way, but he's like, what about when you are alive and it's more about who you're being now for the people around you, not this like imaginary idea of where you were going to be.
Yeah, I completely agree. What do you think it means to be good? Like, what is a good person, and
Great
what defines
question. That? Well, I mean, with Vipassana specifically, they have these sort of precepts that you would follow, and there are things like obviously abstaining from killing, not harming others. It would sort of be like not having ill thoughts towards anyone else. It would be everything from not harming like insects or killing these things, not doing drugs or engaging in certain activities, which, you know, all makes sense. And then we live in this modern world where we have so many things tempting us, which I think are fine, that they don't make a person a bad person.
Like eating a steak?
Yeah. You know, or having some alcohol. It's fine. There's a spectrum of good and bad. For me, again, it's been accepting that I am going to hurt people and people are going to hurt me. So I don't think being good, again, is this just absolutely pure person who never trips up. But perhaps it's around our intentions, or for me, it's just like an awareness of what we're doing, like not operating unconsciously or operating on default. And then if we do harm someone, like being aware of that and potentially asking for forgiveness, like things that a lot of people don't do these days. There's some of the things that come to mind about being good. A big thing, I think, is like speaking honestly, but speaking honestly like with yourself before you can speak honestly with others. Those sort of things come to my mind. And also trying to maybe, create something for someone else, like not living in such an insular me, my, I world, realizing that there's a bigger picture, and seeing that we're all going through these things together. So like sharing that and not judging each other and sort of, dissolving your ego in a way.
How have you, so some of those lessons, how have you, can you give me like some ideas or examples of like manifestations of that when you've come out of the course? And I know obviously the most recent time you did it was like a week ago, so that might need a little bit of time. But you know, I think there's so much that I still totally agree with in terms of personal application and ability to deal with challenges. But from the perspective of things you just spoke about then, about being good and doing for others and thinking about your role sort of in the community, in the world, is a bit like, can you talk about how you've been able to do that coming out of this sort of teaching? Or how you've done more of that maybe over time?
And because the other thing is, it's like, how do you integrate that into your world when you come out of something like vipassana, where it's very easy to be good and just meditate every day and think of goodwill or, you know, loving kindness for everyone else. And then you're thrown into the world where you've got bills to pay and people to look after and deadlines to hit and money to make. And it's a lot harder. I think for me, it's about, because you also want to have goals and aspirations and like satisfy those needs and desires that you have in your life without being attached to them or thinking that they will equal your happiness. I'm trying to think of like some really practical examples, but for me, it's like we all have to interact with people every day, whether that's the relationships that you're in, whether that's with your family, or whether that's in business partnerships or events. And I will often come across people where we disagree with each other or we have different worldviews. And before, I would take it probably very personally that they didn't agree with me, or that they would, you know, if there was an altercation or if it ended badly, I would hold on to that for so much longer than the actual event itself. And I think now it's been a big lesson for me to accept things as they are, that there's going to be suffering, that people are going to disagree, that people are going to hurt each other, that it's not about carrying that with me for longer really than necessary. And it has helped. It has made me like a happier person. It's made me be more empathetic in the moments where people react themselves with aversion or craving, when they're wanting me to be a certain way or they're not wanting me to be a certain way, to just sort of accepting that we're all human and we have these sort of defaults to react. And a lot of people they talk about in Vipassana that they're either miserable or they're ignorant. They're not aware. They don't know what's happening either. And so for me, I always say I want to cultivate like awareness in more people. And like this conversation is an example of how we can do it. Just having small chats with people about how they're thinking or why they think about things in the way that they do. Like that's the biggest thing for me. and again, just sort of promoting this curiosity, or for people to ponder themselves, what is the point? Because I thought everyone thought like me. And then I realized, like, some people, some of my closest friends, I don't think have read one book about philosophy or spirituality or self-help. Or sometimes I'm like, have you thought about what happens when we die, or like why we're here, or what it means to be good? Some people don't.
Yeah, definitely. How do you, like you spoke about just then, like the awareness of other people and what they're going through, and the ability to sort of actually have discourse with people. How do you think about the world at the moment, where things are like so divided on every single cultural topic? And I think you've got probably an interesting vantage point on it, being a girl in beauty and the marketing world that's sort of, living northern suburbs, but then you've got your parents are probably a bit more conservative, sort of right-leaning. Where do you think things are? I think things are in a really like bad spot. What do you think the cause is?
Yeah, it's so hard. And it's one of the things I love about our friendship, and appreciate that you and I can sit and have a conversation about a topic, for example, religion, that we know that we might not agree with each other or hold the same views, but we hold that space for each other. And there's a real curiosity, or at least from my side, to like hear your point of view and to learn and to understand why these things might appeal to you, even if they don't appeal to me. Like, we're different people. We have these different models. We have had these different experiences that pull us towards certain beliefs and values. And my parents are a great example. I found myself in a 3-hour debate with them the other night around what's going on in the world. And I was like, don't take the bait, don't take the bait. And I took it, and it was uncomfortable at the best of times. But I actually was like grateful for it afterwards.
What was that topic?
It wasn't too explosive. Oh, it was just good old Palestine chat. And it was really difficult, and I didn't agree with most of what they said. But I think it was where my practice as vipassana came into, where I was just like, one, this conversation, this heated debate is going to pass. I don't need to get attached or like fired up myself. And then to say, like, to really think about both my parents, and to be like, I know why they think this way and where their beliefs are coming from and their values. And it doesn't mean that they're necessarily like a bad person. It's like, it's either their ignorance or their experience coming into play here, and they only know what they know. And sometimes they're not comfortable with the gray of the conversation. And I remember it was something that my stepmom said to me. She's just like, you can't just sit in the gray. You're being a fence sitter. And I was like, well, I think it's really important to be a fence sitter these days. I think it means that I'm thinking critically about this. I'm not jumping to conclusions. I'm not going with my gut reaction. I'm thinking that this is a much bigger issue than my experience and my knowledge permits me to have a qualified opinion on. So I'm not having a black and white opinion about it. And I think people want that, they want people to just, and to be fiery and all of that. And for me, I'm like, these issues are beyond a lot of us and are very complicated. And sometimes it's about sitting with the discomfort of it and the suffering that's present in the world right now. And that's not an excuse or saying like we shouldn't take action or we shouldn't do things, but it's about being like, we have to sit with this and think about maybe what the bigger message is or the bigger learnings are. I think social media, which is obviously a world that is such a big part of my work and my life, has made things worse and fueled a lot of it. But also, social media has been incredible for the world and for people in a lot of other ways. So it's just this trade-off. And again, it's this gray situation. I don't think the answer is that we should get rid of social media. And this is the thing. Everyone's like, well, then what is the answer? And no one is comfortable with me saying, well, I don't know right now. I'm just sitting with it and I'm feeling the discomfort of it. And this is, I think, the thing. No one wants to feel uncomfortable. Everyone wants to have their experience or their opinion validated. And I wish people could sit there and be like, okay, you have your opinion and I have mine, and I don't agree, but we're going to sit in this like uncomfortable situation. And how can I love my dad and completely disagree with something that he says, but still be like, okay, I still love you.
Mm.
You know, it's a hard thing.
Have you had, I mean, I think we're sort of unique in our discussions that we have, and you mentioned it, where we can sit down and have different views and be completely cordial with each other. Obviously with parents, it's a little bit hard, a little bit harder, and obviously you got a generation gap as well. Do you, when there's like debate on topics sort of in the open public forum, whether that's on social media or in in face-to-face settings, do you get involved at all? And like, do you even say things like what you've just said then, or do you find yourself now with more and more sort of heated debate every way that there's no point even entering into discussion, and you just sort of pull back from it?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because I don't want to talk about something that I am not at least somewhat well read on or have experience on. So I more often than not will bow out of a conversation, because I think it's fair enough to have maybe just a personal opinion. I'll be like, look, off the bat, my gut tells me this, but I won't engage any further, because then it's I just feel like it's a moot case. Like there's no point. It's like, that's not my experience. It's not my qualification. It's like we should be listening to experts in the field regarding certain topics. In other instances, I think we should be having more conversations about things, or I think like specifically an example might be in the beauty industry. Like I am quite known to be quite forthright in my objections around cosmetic interventions and plastic surgery and Botox. And I think I'm entitled to have an opinion about that and to say what my personal preferences are and the reasons that I think such choices are damaging, both for individuals and then their influence on others. And I have tried to have these conversations by also listening to people on the other side and trying to just understand their motivations and their opinions. And at the end of the day, respecting their choices, but just being like, let's talk about it and let's really probe deeply about why we think or feel the way we do and where these motivations are coming from. Like, what do we know about ourselves as to why we've arrived at this point? I think that's my biggest thing, is asking people, how did you get to that conclusion? Which a lot of people don't know. And it's so fascinating to ask someone why at least 3 times. They often sort of trip themselves up and to be like, oh shit, I don't know why I think that way. And that's been my journey over the last 7 years, being like, why do I think that way? Where did I learn this? Like, where did it initially come from? It's what I get really, I guess, excited about rather than the actual topic itself. But I have found that over the years, or particularly say through work, that I've had to be mindful of how I deliver my message. And it's not about not saying what I think, but just thinking about how I deliver that. And I often say, like, within the industry, like, it's an advertising challenge or a marketing challenge. It's like a Trojan horse, right? Like, people don't want to feel attacked. People don't want to feel like you're questioning their ethics or their moral code, but people are willing to have a conversation so long as you make them feel safe to engage in that. So for me, I have at times gone in too hard on conversations, or definitely attacked people, or had this negative bias view when I've approached a conversation. So I've tried to be much more inquisitive and like curious to understand someone's point of view, even if I know from the get-go that I blatantly disagree or that these people don't know what they're talking about, but to let them talk about it, because then they often do reveal that they don't actually maybe understand or know what they're talking about. And then they start asking questions themselves. And that's where there's this opportunity for both parties to learn about each other and then learn about themselves and potentially change their own mind.
Mm-hmm. What's your views? It's a good little segue on controversial topics and ones where there's such strong opinions, both sides. One where you're probably far better versed to give an opinion on it than myself for obvious reasons, but the topic of feminism and where females have ended up in the world in 2024, like being in the beauty industry, and you've seen all the different sort of views, and what's your view on the idea of feminism?
Like what is my definition of it now, or where
Yeah.
it's been
Yeah,
and where it's going?
I think that's a good way of starting. What's your definition
Yeah.
of it? Because I've definitely got a different definition of it than maybe what the mainstream is.
Can I ask what your definition is?
Yeah, I would say it's. Well, let's put it this way. I think the idea of strong feminism is probably a lot more closely aligned with what modern feminism would seek to be the opposite of. So probably the strongest and most impressive females that I've ever been around are more like, probably my mother-in-law is a great example of that. She's works at a factory. She's never really done anything more interesting than that, but raised 3 kids, took them over from one side of the world to another through a war, is the absolute sort of rock of the household, has never had a magazine article written about her. Not more than 20 people would know what her name is. She's got, 6 grandchildren now that sit on her lap and cuddle her, and she gives them chocolates, and yet then I've known some super successful and highly intelligent and high achieving females that have had complete burnouts because they've achieved everything that the modern world says they need to achieve as strong, independent women, and then sort of been left with nothing at the end of it.
Look, I think this is a conversation that you could apply to masculinity as well. It's just like, what is our,
100%, yeah.
And that's actually something I think that I'm really more curious about, is that, again, we just try and have these black and white conversations about men and women. And that's my probably biggest frustration. Like, if anything, right now we are having conversations that gender and sexuality are much more fluid and interchangeable. And again, if I go back to Vipassana, constantly changing. And yet we get attached to these ideas. We crave this idea of a woman or a man, and then we have aversions to other ideas of a woman or a man. And we're still trying to just put them in these boxes. I think that a woman is so many things and can be so many things, not just the different versions of a feminist that we have spoken about or talk about over time. I only in the last couple of years have sort of dipped my toes in feminist literature to try and again understand, because I might have my gut reaction of what I feel about feminism in the past or what it is today, but I knew that there was probably so much more that I had to understand, of which I'm really just getting into. And there's very obvious and apparent influences over time that we can't ignore and that can't be argued, in which women have had to, fight for their identity and to define their place in the world. And I think that has taken extreme forms. It's been a pendulum in each individual trying to find what feels right. And there is not a right answer. It is not this woman that stays at home and is happy to do so. It is not the woman that is flying the corporate ladder trying to compete with the definition of a man. I think that a woman is more of this sort of individual that, again, has to be aware of her own needs and desires and cravings and aversions, and to just define what it is that she's going to step forward into the world today. And I mean, that's my personal feelings around it right now. But if you were to just ask what's the kind of overall narrative that I'm witnessing, is there, particularly over the last couple of years and in the field that I've been in, feminism has taken this very weird sort of path, or my direct experience has been, for example, this girl boss era, and this sort of very women taking on these more masculine traits to compete and to reject certain lifestyle choices or attributes of the woman from the past. And I see how we got to that place. And again, my curiosity was just like, why? Why did the girl boss era start? Like, why did we want that? And I've since learned like why we wanted that and what women were fighting for and what they were trying to prove to themselves and to people outside of them. And then I can see how women also then realize, well, this isn't it. That's kind of not the answer either. And then why in the last couple of years, the girl boss era has been really rejected. And I think that we're actually in this interesting period now of sort of uncertainty, which is sort of beautiful. Like it's not that defined right now. I think people are sort of trying to figure stuff out.
Bit more in the grey.
Yeah, for sure. And which is also hard because we have so much more content that we are consuming. It's very hard to know how you truly feel about something versus what society and what the internet is telling us to feel about something. So the pressure it's intense. So it's really hard. And that's why I think it's important for both women and men to read some of these sort of literature pieces to understand where we've come from, to then understand where we are right now and then where we could go. It's not enough to just be like, oh, I feel this way, this is my opinion. It's like we can only understand our present by understanding the past, right? And then for me, it's this really nice idea that like the future is a child of the present, right? So we got to look after the present and nurture that and nourish that. And that will look after the future for us.
Yeah, I think it's a great answer. I agree. I think it's there's so much more nuance in things than often what is put out there.
Yeah.
What are the big? I'm wary of your time, and it's been a great chat thus far. What are the big questions you're sort of pondering now, and what do you see next 5 years? What from a thought perspective, like what do you see yourself thinking about more as time goes on?
Yeah, I love that because I've always thought of my life in 5-year blocks as well, which is really interesting. And like, I mean, off the back of the conversation we were just having about feminism, like before this, I was just having a wine with my friend and she was talking to me about a book which I've just ordered, which I'm really excited to read because I'm at this point in my life at 35 where it's like, do I want children? You know, what was my idea of being a woman, a mother or not? And so the book is like women who don't have children, or what's the exact title? Let me get it up. Anyway, it's about, women who choose not to have kids. And there's obviously like there's black and white approaches about that. People are just like, it's great if you do it. This is the feminist movement, like reject the traditional housewife role. And then there's people who are like, it's the most beautiful thing that you can do. And being a mother is everything. That's something I think about a lot because I'm on the fence about it. I'm just like, it could be great and it could also not be great. And I'm in this sort of, privileged position to think about that. And I think it's funny because I see a lot of other women struggling with that. So I feel lucky that it's a much more like just curious exploration for me as opposed to an internal struggle. I also think about, how I can contribute with the work that I do outside of just like my benefit, like my creative benefit, my financial benefit, etc. And even though fluff from a superficial sense is like a makeup brand or a beauty brand doesn't seem that deep, like for me, it is still a different narrative in the industry that I hope is making people reflect about their relationship to beauty and their relationship to their external appearance and presentation versus what's going on internally. So there's a lot of like sort of purpose coming from that aspect of my career. I get a lot of joy, like I'm trying to write a book about our relationship to beauty, and that explores a lot about the influences on women in particular over their life and how they see themselves and then present themselves. And I'm just always thinking about that, like how have I arrived at this point and how I think about the world, like what's influenced me over time, what can I change, like these models in my life, like what do I want to do going forward and what would I want to teach. a child, whether that's my child or someone else's, about themselves. And then I have like greater sort of more existential sort of questions where I'm like, where will we be? Like, how is everyone going to communicate and interact with each other? And often I think about the conversation I had with my parents over dinner, and I'm like, what could that look like in the future, where it's people really listening to each other and not just waiting for their chance to interrupt or tell them that their idea or their thought is crazy or ridiculous, but being like, okay, thanks for sharing your different point of view. Like, what would be the point of us all just thinking exactly the same way? It's like, it's actually quite amazing that we can have these rich, different experiences and opinions, and to like listen to that and to understand it, because it all comes from somewhere. And that's what I wish we gave more time to. And it's actually probably my biggest frustration, is that we don't have a lot of time in the Western world. We don't make a lot of time for these things. We're under so much pressure, or make so much pressure for ourselves. So it's like, will we arrive at a place where we have more time for curious conversations with each other?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you gave it a little bit in the very first question, but one of my favorite answers to a question, and something I haven't done enough over time, but I'm trying to do, definitely doing more now, is if someone presents an idea or a question to you, the answer is saying, I don't know, but let me study that. We just don't hear that. Yeah, everyone just wants to respond straight away. No, that's wrong. Here's what's right. But actually thinking and really deeply understanding the best opposing view to what you have now, working out why that's there. Could you be wrong? What are your blind spots? And then studying it. And if it is wrong, great, but at least you're better informed in that discussion, and that can lead to better relationships with people too.
Yes, 100%. And that's why I'm obsessed with books, and why half of my bookshelf is books I haven't read, but there's this really beautiful Japanese term that talks about this, about someone who amasses more unread books than books they've read, but it's a signifier of their values or of the knowledge that they want to acquire, and the ideas that they are interested in. And it's, for me, it's just sort of like this bookmark of like, I want to learn more about that, or I want to be able to engage in a conversation about that, but I don't know enough. And you're right, like for someone to accept that someone's saying like, hey, I don't know, I've got to come back to you. Like, and to be like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, they're not just going to say stuff to fill a void. They're going to just pause and be like, I'm going to come back.
Definitely. Have you still got that Bible I gave you sitting on the unread bookshelf?
I do. No, I told you I read it.
You didn't tell me that.
Oh, no, when you texted me and you said there's this one, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, and that's embarrassing.
Ecclesiastes, yeah.
Yes. And I read it, and I was like, and it's so funny because I was like, oh God, if Luke turns me, I'm going to kill him. But again, like, I think the Bible is a fascinating piece of literature. I'm just like fascinated that it was created, and like how it came to be, and that whether you're religious or not, we cannot deny that the Bible's teachings like underpin the fabric of society and our moral code and how we act and interact with each other. And I think the language is like difficult. Like, I want to like rewrite it as this like modern text. I think would be so interesting.
Because I think I gave you the King James, which is like 1600, so it's that old English. And a lot of people describe it, they're like, the first time they read it, it was like reading Chinese.
Yes. And so it was a lot, and it's heavy, and I'm much more drawn to sort of like more simple text. But there's obviously like theories that I can't argue with, that I'm like, yeah, that makes sense to me. And then there's obviously stuff that I don't agree with. But yeah, I think it's like a really good reference point. And again, to just understand the world and why people are different and how they think. And I wish I made more time to study other like texts and gospels. And I remember I texted you saying, oh, have you read the Gospel of Mary? Because that came up in a cultural book that I was reading about femininity.
Yeah.
And this book was basically based on the 7 deadly sins and how they were taken from religious texts and how they've been adapted over time and how they influence women unconsciously and how we interact with each other. And so this is where it all unfolds, and it's fascinating. And you can look at something like the Bible much more from just a curiosity, like intellectual point of view. And that's why I loved chatting to you about it, because you're one of the smartest people I know. And I know that you wouldn't just, enter into something like this without going deep. And you've thought about it, and you've come at it from the total other end experience. And that's why I'm like, I've got all the time in the world to listen to you talk about it, because I think it's interesting.
Well, I'm glad I've got one person.
This episode will be listened to by us.
Definitely. No, I'll be listening to it tomorrow.
Yeah.
Well, Eri, I've really enjoyed our chat. I love our chats over the journey, but it's been good to sort of get you in the hot seat and formalize it a bit. And maybe you and I are the only two that'll ever listen to it again. But if one other person does, I hope they enjoy it.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And again, it's like I said to you, and I really mean it. I have been on a few podcasts and I talk about the same stuff every day. And it's refreshing to remind myself that I'm more than a beauty founder, or more than more than talking about the internet or social media. Like, we are human beings all trying to figure this out. And we have these conversations sometimes behind closed doors, or in moments of desperation with our friends or with our partners or with our family, being like, what's the point in this all? Like, I think it's a deep curiosity in everyone. And I think there's something kind of very weird or strange if no one ever has that thought.
Spot on.
And it's really nice to hear other people discuss what the point could be and hear all those different versions.
Well, thanks for giving yours.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Look forward to seeing it evolve over time.
Yes, me too.
Thanks, Eri. Appreciate the chat.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit like and subscribe to get notified when the next episode is live.